Welcome to the Desert City Church office. Thank you so much for being here today. What you're going to hear is a sermon that I am preparing for our church a few weeks out. You're getting kind of a sneak peek today. The purpose of this activity is for a homiletics course that I'm a part of at Fuller Theological Seminary. So I would love your honest feedback and constructive criticism today. The golf ball is making an appearance. Some of you were here for this last time. If you want to, feel free to critique me. You can throw the ball at me if you disagree with something, or you want me to be quiet. You can do that too. So it's going to happen one of these days. It's going to be exciting. So, but I wanted to start today with a story that takes place down in Paraguay in South America. There's a town down in Paraguay that was built around a trash dump. And the people in the town got their livelihood off of the trash dump. They would use trash, repurpose it, sell it. And it was a pretty poverty-stricken slum of Paraguay. There wasn't a lot of hope for this town. It was a dangerous place to live in. And there was a man named Kola who was walking through the trash dump one day, and he found an old, broken violin in the trash dump and decided that he wanted to rebuild it and start playing music. And he was able to do that, and then decided, I wonder what else I could do with instruments here in the trash dump. So went around and started finding things that resembled other instruments, rebuilt a flute, a cello, and a bunch of just kind of classical instruments. Found a local musician named Fabio Chavez and showed him the instruments that he had repurposed and said, what if we started an orchestra here for children? It would get the children out of the trash dump, out of the slums, and teach them about classical music. Well, it turns out that the children in the town ended up loving this idea, and the children in the town, lo and behold, were extremely gifted musicians. So they started playing together. They started learning how to play classical music, and an orchestra formed. They called it the Landfill Harmonic. And they started to grow in popularity, so much so that other towns started hearing about them. They went viral on YouTube. They've grown so popular that they're worldwide, and they're making a movie about this landfill harmonic, this group of children who play instruments made out of trash. The leader of this group, Fabio Chavez, was asked, what in the world, how were you able to pull this off, that you would take these children from the slums, repurpose trash, and build an orchestra? And he has this line that I just think is so significant. He said, when the world sends us trash, we make music. When the world sends us trash, we make music. And I thought that was such a beautiful line, and such a great thought, especially as we turn to this passage in Scripture that I want to share today. Because the Scripture that I want to share takes place in the book of Genesis. And it's about a man named Joseph. And it's about a man who has just trash dumped on him all of the time. And I want to start in this story and look at what happens kind of at the end of his life. And I want to keep this idea of the landfill harmonic in mind as we read his story. And his story, if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 50, we'll start at the end of his story. In Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 14, it says, After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. So we find that there's this man named Joseph. He has brothers, and his father has just passed away. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? Which immediately means there's a backstory, right? Something's happened and they're afraid of him. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. And when their message came to Joseph, Joseph wept. His brothers came and they threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So there's a lot going on here in this story. Obviously, there's a backstory. How we got to this point where you have Joseph, who obviously is this man of high influence, who has these brothers who have done something to him in his past, and now they're afraid of him, and he's offering grace and forgiveness. This story, if you kind of look back at early on in life, we can start to kind of see the backstory of what's happening here. In Genesis chapter 37, Joseph comes onto the scene, and he's 17 years old, young teenager, and it says that in chapter 37 that he's one of 12 brothers. His family, they're shepherds. His brothers are out tending to the sheep. He goes in and he would check in on them every now and then, and he tattles on them. He basically gives a report. He's kind of a narc. And his brothers don't like that. We also know that Joseph is favored by his father. He's given privilege and presents and this coat of many colors, and the brothers are jealous of that. We also know that Joseph has these dreams where his brothers are bowing down to him, metaphorically speaking, and he tells them about it, and they don't like that. And so there's already tension between Joseph and his brothers. And in chapter 37, his brothers go out and they're tending the sheep, and his dad says to Joseph, "Why don't you go out and check in on them, give me a report?" And as the brothers see him coming, they devise this plan that they want to actually kill Joseph. Now, I've had, sibling rivalry with my brother. We're competitive. We fight over video games. We've never gotten to the point where we've wanted to actually kill each other. And they devised this plan to kill Joseph. One of the brothers named Reuben speaks up and he says, "We can't shed Joseph's blood. He's our brother. We can't do this." So they agreed to throw Joseph into this cistern, this old well. They just dump him into the cistern and they're going to leave him and abandon him. So Joseph comes, take him, rip off his coat, throw him into the cistern. And then they're trying to figure out what to do, and they just feel like one of them feels terrible, like, "We can't just leave him here and kill him. He is our brother." And so they devise this plan. There's this group of merchants that are coming through. And they decide, why don't we just sell Joseph to the group of merchants instead of actually killing him? Let's just sell him into slavery. He'll be out of our lives forever. He'll have, some future somewhere, but we don't have to worry about him anymore. Merchants come, they pull Joseph out of the cistern, and they sell him. So what is the harm that's been done to Joseph? Well, to start with, he's been betrayed by those who are closest to him. He's been betrayed by the people that he's supposed to trust. And then he gets abandoned by them. Betrayed and abandoned. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone that you love? I mean, betrayal is terrible at any moment, but especially when it's someone that you trust and love. Joseph is betrayed and then sold into slavery. If that's not bad enough, he ends up, down in Egypt. And we find that he lands at the house of Potiphar, who's like this really high governing official, this person that's close to Pharaoh, who's king of Egypt. And it says that God is with Joseph. And we think, well, maybe the story's going to turn out okay. God's with Joseph. Everything he does is blessed. It gets Potiphar's attention. And Potiphar's like giving Joseph more and more responsibility because he knows that Joseph everything he's doing is like flourishing. He sees that God is with Joseph. But also Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. And it tells us that Joseph is a good-looking, handsome young man, maybe like a younger Tyler Ells, yeah? And so the wife of Potiphar tries to seduce Joseph, and he continually rejects her. Some weird details happen, but eventually gets to the point where she gets fed up with him. And out of her own rejection and pain and maybe insecurity, who knows, she decides to accuse Joseph of trying to seduce her to Potiphar. She lies about Joseph and she falsely accuses him, and Potiphar is furious, and he throws Joseph into prison. So now we have this man, Joseph, this young man, who's been betrayed, he's been abandoned, now he's been lied to and falsely accused, and he finds himself in prison again. This time in prison, God says God is with him, and in this story, he runs into two very important people that were in the king's court. One of them is a cupbearer for Pharaoh. One of them is the chief baker for Pharaoh. And they end up in prison with Joseph, and they start like this friendship. These guys start having these weird dreams, and they're trying to figure out what these dreams mean. And Joseph has been given just this gift by God to be able to interpret dreams. And he comes to them and he says, tell me your dream. They tell him, and he looks at the cupbearer and he says, I'll tell you what this dream is. It's good news. It means you're going to get out of here. You're going to go back. Your job's going to be restored with Pharaoh. But when you go back and you're restored, tell Pharaoh about me. Don't forget me. Give me a good word. I want to get out of here. And he looks at the baker and he says, your dream, it's not good. Not good, buddy. I don't have any good news for you. And sure enough, the dreams that he interprets become true. And then it says that the cupbearer gets out of jail, goes back to Pharaoh, and he forgets about Joseph. He forgets him. Joseph, who does this great thing helping him, is forgotten. So now we have Joseph, who's been betrayed, abandoned, sold into slavery, lied to, falsely accused, is this forgotten man. And as you read the story of Joseph, you start to realize that we live in a world of cruelty. There are cruel people in this world. And it doesn't matter how good Joseph is, people still treat him poorly. It doesn't matter how hopeful he is or how much he has God with him, people continue to use him and to treat him poorly. There's this great pain that must have been felt late at night in prisons when he had considered how those closest to him betrayed him. When he was doing great, people lied about him, falsely accused him, and now he'd been forgotten. It's this reminder of this broken world we live in. But what's interesting is in the midst of the darkness of this prison, when he's considering all of these harmful things that's been done to him, we know as we read this story that he's being set up into this place where he's exactly where God wants him. He's exactly in the position where God wants him to be, even though he probably doesn't understand that. Because in chapter 41 of Genesis, his story starts to change for the good. We find that Pharaoh starts having these dreams, and he's confused, and he's talking about the dreams, and the cupbearer who knows Joseph from prison overhears the dreams and is reminded that there's this man in prison who can interpret dreams accurately. And he tells Pharaoh about Joseph, and Joseph gets called out of prison, and Joseph shows up, and he hears the dreams from Pharaoh, and he interprets them. He says, this is what these dreams mean. For 7 years, Egypt is going to have an abundant crop like you've never seen. We're going to experience blessing and flourishing, and our economy is going to boom. But after those 7 years, we're going to experience a famine like you've never seen before. And people are going to be starving. So we need to take 7 years and just store up as much food as we can to help make us through the 7 years of famine. Pharaoh's like, mind is blown. Loves the interpretation. Loves it so much that he appoints Joseph to be number 2 in command of all of Egypt. He raises him up to this place of influence and says, you're in charge now. You're in control. Help us get through this famine. And when we kind of go back towards the end of the story, as we started in Genesis chapter 50, this is how Joseph reconnects with these brothers who have betrayed him. They're in this other land, and they're starving. There's no food. They're in the midst of famine. And they hear that there's food in Egypt, and they go to Pharaoh, pleading their case to see if they could have food to eat, because their people are starving. They have no idea that Joseph is number 2 in command, but they know they just need to eat. The story goes on. A number of events happen, and different things start to play out. But essentially what happens is Joseph gets reconnected with his brothers. There's this great reconnection, reconciliation. And then he reconnects with his father, who thinks that he's dead. And it's this joyful moment where they're reconnecting. And because Joseph has been appointed into this position of influence, he's able to feed people who are starving. And then we get to Genesis chapter 50. And Moses' father passes away, and his brothers are freaking out, thinking, was he just being nice to us to honor our father? Or is he going to come and now get his revenge on us for what we've done? Is he going to finally get back at us for selling him into slavery? And they come to Joseph with this question. What are you going to do now? Are you going to take care of us? And what we find is that Joseph responds in such a way that we see that he's able to let go of the terrible things that have done to harm him and move forward in life. And I think that he's able to do this for a couple of reasons that we see in the text. The first is that it says when they come to him afraid. And it says that Joseph weeps about it. He weeps. He grieves the fact that there's this brokenness between him and his brothers. And I think that's important to note, because what this means is that even though God can take the things that have been done to harm us and repurpose them for good, doesn't mean that the things that were done to harm us are not serious. And we see that these are serious, painful things in Joseph's life because he weeps about it. He grieves the pain. And there's something healthy about grieving painful things that happen to us. That's okay. In fact, I think that's where healing starts to happen, is when we're willing to grieve through the pain of the things that have been done to us. And we see that there's something that Joseph does here that releases and allows him to process in a healthy way what's been done to him. He grieves the pain. But then the question is, will you forgive us? And what is he going to do? What is his response going to be? And Joseph says this: am I in the position of God? No. Am I the one that is supposed to bring about? And so what we find him is he has every right to be mad and to be bitter. But in this moment, he actually releases bitterness. So he grieves, and then he chooses to release his bitterness towards the people who have harmed him. Bitterness is an interesting thing. It does interesting things to us as humans. If you look at kind of the definition of bitterness, literally it means like a sharpness of taste or a lack of sweetness. Figuratively, it means anger and disappointment at being treated unfairly, resentment. Bitterness follows unwanted experiences like failures, disappointments, and setbacks that are perceived to be beyond one's control. This is describing Joseph's life. I mean, bitterness occurs when one believes, rightly or wrongly, that other people have prevented or the undesired outcome. Other people could have prevented the undesired outcome. Regret involves blaming others, blaming oneself. The psychologist Karsten Roch says, the quality of the negative emotions we feel when things don't work out may depend on how we appraise the reasons for the failure. If we think that we're the ones responsible ourselves, we may experience like regret and sadness. However, if we feel that it is not our fault, but other people were responsible for the problem, then we may be angry or bitter. It says we have every right to be bitter when other people do things to us. Bitterness is the privilege of the victim. But there's something better. And Joseph chooses something better. Joseph has every right and every privilege to be bitter towards his brothers. But he moves from bitterness to something better. He grieves the pain and he lets go of the bitterness. And what we find is their request for forgiveness. He grants. He forgives them. Joseph says, what you intended for my harm, God is using for good. And the saving of many lives because of it. I'm able to forgive because I know that what is happening here, it's within God's plan. There's this bigger plan in place. And as I move back, as I scale back, and as I have this perspective, I realize like why I've been placed here, the saving of many other lives. And he's willing to forgive. I think forgiveness is one of the strongest forces that humans can experience. And I think it's absolutely essential for us as followers of Jesus to be willing to forgive. To be willing to forgive. I had this friend who's this older woman in the church that I had first started my ministry in, who was very wise and just loved having talks with her about life. She's experienced so much. But I remember we were having this conversation where she was telling me about her upbringing, and she started to share that her upbringing was extremely rough. Her upbringing, her parents, her dad specifically, was just very emotionally abusive. He was just a harsh man. So she grew up with a lot of anger, and she grew up with a lot of resentment towards her father, and felt like her father's, the way that he treated her, had kept her from experiencing just a number of great things in childhood. And she said, like, she held on to this anger and this bitterness and this resentment deep into her adult life. And she was trying to process, like, why she just couldn't enjoy life. She couldn't experience the joy that other people felt. And she had realized that it was deep inside of her, there was this bitterness that was poisoning everything else that she did. And as she was processing, she just felt like when she was processing, it was like God spoke to her and talked about how she has every right to be bitter for the harm that had been done to her by her father. And she had every right to not forgive him and to punish him. And she felt like she had punished him by putting him in this dungeon inside of her soul. And she had put this, that she would keep her father in this dungeon inside of her soul to punish him day after day after day, until finally she felt like she heard the still small voice of God saying, you have every right to keep him in that prison, but you have to continue to feed him. And feeding him is exhausting. And she realized that this process of forgiveness, of being bitter, even though it was her right to be bitter, the process of forgiving was letting her father out of this dungeon of her soul. And when she was able to do that, she found great freedom in her own life, because she no longer had to continue to feed this thing day after day after day. Forgiveness, letting go, even though you have the right to stay angry. We see that in the life of Joseph. He doesn't hold this grudge. He sees grace in everything in life, and that God had been redeeming all of these things that had been done to him that were harmful for something good. He doesn't make light of the pain that was caused. He grieves for it, but he moves on to something better. Forgiveness is something that's absolutely essential to us as followers of Jesus, because forgiveness is a characteristic of the God that we follow. And if we want to understand what forgiveness is, all we have to do is simply look at the cross. Look at what Jesus does on the cross, where all of the things that we've done individually that are harmful to other people around us, we take them to the cross, and we see that all the consequences for our harm are absorbed by Jesus on the cross. God says, I forgive you. We receive forgiveness. But at the same time, to be a follower of Jesus means that I trust the cross. I trust what Jesus did on the cross to not only forgive me of my sin, but all the things that people have done to me in this world that are extremely harmful. On the cross, God absorbs the punishment for those things as well. And to be a follower of Jesus is to say, I can forgive because I have a God who has forgiven me. And I must be willing to forgive others. I must be willing to let them free inside of me. Forgiveness is something that's absolutely essential to our story, to our flourishing as humans. And here we have Joseph. His brothers are requesting forgiveness, and he's saying, am I God? Am I in the place of God? He says, what you've done for me, what you've done against me, God has redeemed it for something good. And the story that we're a part of is the story of this eternal God who has this eternal future with us, who is perfectly just and perfectly graceful and perfectly merciful, who says, I see all the things that have been done to you that are absolutely terrible. But if you give me a chance, I'm going to spend the rest of your life and into eternity redeeming those things for something good. What was meant for harm, God turns for good. What was given to you to be trash, God takes and makes music out of it. So today we're going to close our time with communion, which we do each week. And as we close our time with communion, I thought these words from Mother Teresa would be appropriate. And I feel like they just resonate with the story of Joseph. It says, people are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. If you are honest and frank, people may cheat you, but be honest and frank anyway. What you spend years building, someone could destroy overnight. Build anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, they may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today, people often forget tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. But give the world the best you have anyway. You see, in the final analysis, it is between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. Let's pray.